Hey, all, welcome to the Common Good Podcast. It's January 27th today, which makes it a Thursday where we get to talk about important issues that happen in our world. And I'll tell you, I'm pretty excited about this one because Gregg Hurwitz is here. And I'm a big fan of Gregg's, love working with him, and can't wait for you all to meet him and the work that he's doing. I'm, as we often do here in Minnesota, where I look out that window and it's a balmy 11 degrees. So we're feeling great today because that's 11 above, Gregg, 11 above. And Gregg, you're out in the beautiful sands of Southern California. Is that right?
That's right. And I will not tell you what the temperature looks like outside my window right now for fear of eliciting some Doug Pagitt fury.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, just let us live in our ignorance over here. Hey, Gregg, you've done a lot of things in your life. A lot of people might know you by your writing career. You're a screenwriter. You're a novelist. You're a comic writer, which I've never read a comic. Can you believe this? So I can't speak to that. I'm a big fan of your books. You have one coming out here this week or next week. And so you do a lot. But we met not because of your great fiction writing and because of your great storytelling ability. We actually met because of the work that you and a number of others in the Hollywood screenwriting community were trying to do to help Democratic candidates message better. But actually, it's always been a larger narrative than that. It seems to me that you really believe that Trumpism and a kind of takeover of the Republican Party has been so dangerous for our society, and that we really have to tell different stories. Our politicians have to tell different stories. Our civic conversation has to elicit a different input from everyone. So, you're famous in your own world of your occupation, but you also have these other passions that you're about.
That's right. And I think, part of our connection, why you and I have wound up working together so closely, is because I feel like you have a sort of outreach and a generosity of spirit when it comes to addressing people who might think differently and perceive the world through a different value structure than we do. And that's been a huge part of what's informed my approach to politics and political advising, which is not to vilify the opposing side. It's to make better, good faith arguments about what sorts of values we stand for.
Yeah. And
to really seek to identify and find the common good in other people, to turn a unique phrase. And so, part of that was when President Trump was elected, I had a different reaction, I would say, than most people who would identify primarily as Democrat, which was I thought it was really time for us to look in the mirror as liberals and say, what did we and what have we been getting so wrong in so many ways that President Trump was considered a better alternative than the ideas and the candidates that we're putting forth for, close to half the country. And I think any process of outreach or transformational change, it always has to start with an honest inward reflection. Because if you can't change your own perceptions, it's easy to blame it on the polarization of news. It's easy to blame it on Fox News. It's easy to blame it on the fact that, as both sides feel, the other side is, immoral and wrong. Right. But I really think that there's no gold in them. They're hills, right? The only way to move forward in concert with somebody else to try and reach a new meaning and a new shared sense of community is to look within. And so, I mean, it's hardly a fresh observation, but it's one that I took on in earnest in 2016 and have tried to hold to as best as I can.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, the work that I've been in with you, you do a great job of calling us to that. It's really really meaningful. Can you talk a little bit about what gave you the gumption to do this, to sort of think, hey, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pull together a group of screenwriters and Hollywood, professionals, and offer their services to political messaging for politicians. Because a lot of us, we woke up on November 9th, 2016 and said, things are not the way we thought they were. Obviously, the world looks much different than we thought. And everyone scrambled around trying to figure out, what should I do? What could I do? Is there something that could be different next time? And you thought, Hey, I need to reach out to the Democratic Party and talk to them about messaging and talk to them about why this failure of connection has happened. What told you that's a route that you should take?
Such an interesting question. I mean, the first thing I'll say is that, I think that reality is where ideology goes to die.
Hmm.
And so one of the first things that I was intent upon was doing things that would have concrete outcomes. I was interested, I think we have to get away from sort of permission structures and language play and get to people's intentions and get to concrete outcomes. And if you get to concrete outcomes, there's no room for ideology in that. Either the ideology has um, has given sort of groundwaters into something that where something will flourish and grow, or it won't, or quite often it's
Nice.
a combination. Maybe a solution's 50% conservative, 50% liberal. Maybe it's 90-10, maybe it's 70-30. But the outcome of who we are helping and the kind of new stability that we're ideally bringing and a new sense of community, working against toxicity and polarization, it doesn't come from that.
Hmm.
And so that was part of it. And then a lot of this were the doors that opened to me.
Hmm.
I'm not interested in politics almost at all, Doug. It's not. I'm interested in storytelling, narrative, and psychology. Um, and I felt like, because of my books, I write thrillers, predominantly. And because of my background, even my family background, I have a very wide array of friends. So I grew up a secular, Jewish, San Francisco Bay Area. I'm now a Hollywood screenwriter. Like, if I was any more on brand, I'd be a Tesla, basically.
you, you
You
think?
know,
Yeah.
but among my closest friends are, born again Christian, son of missionaries, right? Navy SEAL sniper, born again Christian. I have friends who, range from every community, from evangelical, gay, transgender, just all around the map. And a lot of these relationships, especially with people who are conservative, are people where I know their character. We have a genuine relationship and connection. I can't dismiss them because they voted for Trump, that it's because they're stupid, that it's because they're uneducated,
Yeah.
because they don't know what I know. And if only they were better educated into empathy, that they would vote my direction. And so I think it grew out of a real base of me from my research, from the kinds of people I talk to. I have a lot of friends in the military, other communities like that, because I want my books to talk to a whole cross section of readers and people with all sorts of different
Hmm.
stories. I don't want to write propaganda, right? I don't want to write stories that I already know what I think about everything. And so there's a constitutional openness, I think, that comes from being creative by design. Some of it is my family background, and then some of it were these doors opened up. And I think first I went to DC. I think the Democrats were very humbled and scared after Trump's election, and it opened the door for them to listen to a bunch of typists from Hollywood to come out and have opinions. But very quickly, I zeroed in on the fact that the ethic that I brought with me was, I had really big opportunities. I got to address the Democratic Senate caucus and the House caucus. We met with leadership. We met with presidential leaders. It immediately had a level of access that was huge. And I chose to view that not as a move towards power or influence, but as a move towards greater responsibility. And as part of that responsibility, I decided that I would tell the truth as best as I could in every situation, no matter how that was received or what the cost might be to me personally. And it turns out that in doing that, more doors continued to open, and more people wanted to hear what it was that I thought and how I'd frame things. And initially, I went back under the guise of we're storytellers. We can tell you how to tell the story.
Yeah.
But then what I realized is there wasn't as much of a psychological understanding of dynamics of persuasion, dynamics of talking to people who are different, understanding the psychology of conservatives versus liberals, which is very constitutionally different in ways that are, genetic and
Hmm.
immutable almost, in terms of how trait structures work. And are we willing to talk about classically liberal values through a value frame that is more palatable to conservatives,
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
pitch our ideas basically in a language that conservatives can hear based on their quite wonderful and effective value sets? And if we're not, why is that? Right? Is it because we like the fact that our views are is it that then our views have to go to a kind of self identity? And that we know which salad fork to use, right, at the
Yeah.
fancy dinner.
How was that? How was that met? And I asked this question because at Vote Common Good, we do this work. We work with a lot of candidates. We do a lot of training for how to reach the kind of voters that we think could make a difference in some elections. And I would be surprised. I've been surprised at how many times people have said to me from inside the political system, it's just not worth it. We don't want to spend our time and energy trying to get these people who vote for Republicans or identify as conservatives. It's not worth it. And frankly, we want to stop needing those people. We don't want to feel like we're constantly having to recast all this to bring those people over. We would rather have an approach that sort of gets to, a turnout model of the people who think like us. People are sometimes brutally honest, never a candidate, but sometimes their staff or their campaign will just say, yeah, we love the work you're all doing, but it's not for us. We're not going to spend our energy there. Have you heard similar things? Do you get a little pushback sometimes from, maybe it's not politicians or liberals or other people, but do you hear people saying like, look, we just have to stop the being on the explanation train and constantly trying to recruit these people? Barack Obama heard a lot of that from more progressives during his time. Like, you spend all your time hoping. Biden's hearing that now, that hoping these people are going to come over. They never will. They're just not worth it. Did you get that pushback? Do you hear that? And how do you respond when you do?
All the time. And it's worse now than ever in terms of the sides just not speaking. I mean, there's some Republicans I speak to who tell me they don't have a single Democrat who speaks to them. And so, look, that position might be a fantastic, super short-term strategy. There's no middle term, there's no long term in that. It's no different than a marriage, right? This is half of America. It's pretty cleanly half of America. And what are we going to do? We're in a marriage. Do any marriages work if the two sides have decided that like communication should cease? What happens when communication ceases? Right? There's a reason the First Amendment is the First Amendment and the Second Amendment is the Second Amendment, right? And part of that is if we can't combat, negotiate, disagree, argue, confront, compromise, disagree with words, we're going to do it with fists and we're going to do it with guns. And that's what's going to happen. And everybody knows this. This is something like, if you just stop and think about where things are headed, that's where it heads. And the less we talk, the more reinforcement we have for more radical voices, the more we gerrymander, and the more that our news sources move towards, click, outrage entertainment, unfriending people in the virtual realm, and then in the literal realm who think differently from us, the more we have movement to more radicalization. How's that working out for us? How many people feel less stressed about our political and cultural environment, right? How many families are getting along better now around the issue of politics? It's just not working, and everyone's aware. So if you want to do a short-term grab of outrage, can you outrage and terrify enough people to show up and vote for your candidate? Sure, you can do that, and maybe we have one more election, but at some point it's going to break one way or the other, and nothing would be more disastrous than, I think, a culture that is ruled by, or a society that's ruled by, one half with an iron fist over another half who feel subjugated.
Yeah. It seems to me that our politics, it's kind of hardwired into people for whatever reason, whether it's by habit or by, as you say, maybe even a constitution that puts them, an emotional, psychological constitution that puts them in one camp or the other. I don't know what percentage it is, but a bunch of people are going to vote for Republicans no matter what. A bunch of people are going to vote for Democrats no matter what. Then there's some people who will switch. There's some people who haven't yet decided where they fall. They kind of move about. I'm really interested in people who voted one way their whole life or have seen one identity, and they're willing to take on a new identity, because I think a lot of personal growth and change for individuals and societies is really an identity issue. So people have to overcome and make a change in their identity. And the biggest hurdle to overcoming an identity is believing that other group frankly doesn't like you. At a very deep base level, it's might come out as I don't like them, but you're pretty certain they don't like you. And that's so true in politics. People are so convinced that the other side doesn't understand them, know them, and if they did, they would like them even less than they already don't like them now. Do you have that same sense? I mean, you're such a gracious spirit. You're so open to people. You have these friends. You're probably trapped all the time in these conversations where people say things about the kind of people who are actually your friends, and you're like, well, I do like those people that you find so reprehensible.
Yeah, not just like, I mean, love. I've people who I disagree with on virtually every political issue who I've relied on in situations that felt like they were life or death. And it's
Mm,
like, that's more important to me than,
mm,
which Chad they're knocking out of a ballot. I mean, a couple observations about what you said. It's important to remember we also have 80 million people who are so disillusioned or feel like politics is so useless, they're not even bothering to show up. That's
yeah.
as many people as voted for either candidate. And the other thing I'll say is that the average Obama Trump voter, so let's call that a true swing voter, thinks about politics 4 minutes a week. 4 minutes a week, as opposed to people in these different camps who probably don't think about politics 4 minutes a week. So what are they thinking about? If you're an out of work electrician with a special needs kid, a parent in a home, and you lost your health care,
Yeah.
you don't have time to think about what an emoluments clause is or what social cultural appropriation is. It comes down to me, like the one fundamental
Yeah.
unifying
Mm,
statistic for me above all else is that in the last 40 years since Reagan, $50 trillion with a T has moved from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. Now, some of that is due to globalization, and some of that I'm sure is due to free market, but this is not predominantly due to free market capitalism that rewards innovation and competition. This is due to corporations figuring out that lobbyism and petitioning and monopolies are more successful and easier than promoting things that are actually truly under what a free market is. And if you look at that framework, you can understand why a lot of people who voted for Trump, there's a lot of similarities to people who were ravished in the
mm,
opioid crisis. You're from that community. Well, guess what? You might have a distrust. Like if you look at cultural issues through this frame,
yeah.
if you had an uncle and a son who died in an opioid crisis, you might have some hesitation about the big pharma government experts giving advice about a vaccine. If you're in the African American community, with a history of, Miss Evers boys of the,
Hmm.
the syphilis experiments in it's, you might have a very healthy hesitation of wanting to be brought in to, a different perspective on any topic in a way that comes from a respect and regard from where you're coming from and where your values and community are. So there's that. And then there is this unbelievable level of vitriol bordering on disgust.
Hmm.
And disgust is more threatening in some ways. I mean, I just got back from a meeting in DC where I met with a lot of people across the aisle, and you bring up something to the other side of who you sat down with, and a very common remark is like, "Oh, I hope you took a shower afterwards." It's like this sort of disgust reaction that I hear from left to right and right to left, and that's predominantly what motivated Hitler. Hitler
Mm,
wasn't afraid of the Jews. He was targeting, like, it was like rodents and then homeless people and then Jews and then Slavs, and all the fire imagery was to, like, purify through fire. And this sort of just, when in-group favoritism really folds in, a disgust reaction in some ways is even more
yeah.
polarizing than fear, because fear at least carries with it some respect or some regard. And so the more that I'm seeing these camps separate, the more I'm aware of the fact that we need some kind of, like, we have to break the cycle. It's only moving in one direction right now. And so that's been a big part of what my mission is to figure out, where there's common ground, where are there holes and opportunities for transformation. And I keep thinking, even around these complex issues of, let's say, gender and race in America, which are very loaded, it's like, well, if Desmond Tutu could help figure it out,
Yeah.
right?
That's right.
If he could figure out how to move, a nation that by any description that should have just wound up in genocide and wreckage, right? If he was willing to have that. And so truth and reconciliation is key. But the thing is truth is really painful, right? Truth is the cracking of those constructs, the scaffolding that encompasses, let's call it our identity, the way that you talk about it, with some
Mm,
ideology in there and some
mhm,
notion of what lays beyond that.
mhm.
And so the first thing that you need is a precondition to having truth and then reconciliation with the pain of it is a notion that we have something that is shared between us and there is some future that we need to move to together. Because if we can't identify that, the pain of truth and the pain of reconciliation, it's too big a cost to bear. And right now, I think that's where we're struggling. We're struggling to see actually a common humanity. We're struggling to see a common and shared future with having
Yeah.
any notion of worth of the opposing side.
Yeah, the issue of storytelling to me is not just an issue of like how do we tell the story about policies or candidates or politics, but how do we tell the story of who we are as a country? How do we live in this world? What are we up to? What's this all about? That doesn't exist much in our society right now, and maybe it's because some of the old parts of our society that used to take care of that storytelling have lost some of their influence, often because they've deserved to lose their influence. You know, our education system, our religious institutions, our civic institutions haven't done their part. But it feels like that's a missing piece, is this thread. So you end up with just the pieces of a puzzle, but you don't have a picture to look at. You don't know what you're putting together. All you're looking at are these small pieces and then arguing about if that's an edge piece or not an edge piece and how crucial it is to building this frame. So I feel like that's where we are. I want to ask Gregg a little bit about where this all comes from. You know, if someone goes on Wikipedia and they look you up, they're going to be like, wow, the guy's written 23 books and screenplays and comics and went to Harvard and studied Shakespeare at Oxford. Like just a great pedigree. What they don't see is probably the nicest guy that you'll ever meet. That's not on your Wikipedia page, but if I could get logged in, I will add that. And so, as you say, like you're just on point, you're on type, right, for the kind of thing that someone would say a Hollywood screenwriter would be all about. But how did you grow up? What was your family like? That was the background for you that led to all the rest of that, but also this perspective that you have now.
I would say that real, concrete social and cultural engagement with outcomes. Again, I always stress outcome. In the absence of outcomes, it's just a luxury belief. It's a brand, was really emphasized, in my family. On my mom's side, my grandfather was a, Jewish attorney in New York who went down south to volunteer to represent, Black men who had been accused of crimes, which I'm putting in derisive air quotes, against white women, up for death penalty for different stuff. And he had his life threatened. I mean, he was down south. At one point, someone tried to run, he was threatened by local law. His car was almost run off a cliff. And he went and he did it. And there's a toughness to that. And there's a money where your mouth is aspect to that. And my mother worked in international relations. She's placed between 2,000 and 3,000 children. That was her life's work into families here, adoptions in the US, from all shapes, sizes, and shades, right? Some without limbs, some developmentally delayed, some beautiful and healthy, from Russia and Guatemala and China and Vietnam. And I mean, all around the world. And so I grew up going to these picnics. She used to have an annual picnic every year. And there would be hundreds of kids, right? Sometimes the parents were of matching ethnicity. Sometimes they weren't. She placed kids with gay couples. It was this giant multicultural explosion of joy. And each picnic table in these big parks would have a flag from the home country. And the families would cluster there. And they would all have food laid out from each respective country. And so you would go from table to table and meet, the parents, the children, these beautiful kids of all, and that was my childhood. I mean, my childhood was spent engaging in these families that my mom created. Like her life's work is literally the creation of 2,000 to 3,000 families. And these are kids who would be, languishing in poverty, right? Turned out as child prostitutes. I mean, these are lives that are saved and families that she built. And it was through a celebration of the positive. There's nothing theoretical or ideological about this. And then on the other side, my father is from a family of physicians. His dad was a brilliant doc. My dad grew up in Boston medicine. He was almost ordained for medicine as if for the priesthood. My grandfather, he's around Nobel Prize winning Boston medicine physicians. And my father is a brilliant diagnostician. Both of my parents skew quite liberal, as do I. Like my personal politics are much more liberal than where I think the politics of the country should rightly be. I think
Right.
we all should have some distinction between what
Right.
our personal viewpoint is and what we think is the fair and right thing, in a society. Both of my parents are quite liberal. And so my father, who is a, secular Jewish physician raised in a very Western tradition, I remember one story in particular is quite telling. He's a brilliant diagnostician. Like, it's just uncanny. It's a true gift. But he had a woman come in, and he always, one of the lines my dad says is, you can have an intern look at all the labs, but you want the doctor to take the history, right? Like, the history is everything in medicine. It's not
Wow.
equations. And this woman came in. My dad's a gastroenterologist. She had a lot of irritable bowel syndrome. There's like a lot of GI problems that were happening with her. And I was in high school. My parents, by the way, sent me to a Jesuit high school where I knew nobody. I knew not a single person. I was the smallest kid in a school of 1,200 boys. I was 5'2", 90 pounds starting high school. I went kicking
Oh
and
my gosh.
screaming. And of course, it was like one of the greatest experiences of my life, and huge, huge character building.
Was that because you were not behaving at the other schools that were an option? And they're like, hey, Greg, you keep this up and you're going to go to the Jesuit school?
No, it's because, look, I was around the private school was pretty unidimensional. It was kind of homogenized and not in a very interesting way. There was it was early Silicon Valley. So there was a lot of kind of uniform upper middle class. Everyone got a new Mustang for their 16th birthday. My parents were like, we want to send you elsewhere. My high school, it's Bellarmine College Prep in San Jose, is the most, I believe it's the most ethnically and economically diverse high school in California. It's the oldest high school in California. Jesuits are phenomenal educators, as you
Yeah, they
know.
are.
Us Jews and evangelicals got nothing on them. And look, and it was in San Jose. It was like this sort of explosion of different ideas and people. It was a big sports and academic powerhouse. So my parents had sent me there. So my dad had a patient come in, and she was suffering from irritable bowel, all these gastroenterological symptoms. And he was taking her history, and he found out that she was a very devout Catholic, who I think was even destined maybe to become a nun. And he asked if anything had happened in her life around the time that these symptoms began. And she shared with him that she had gotten an abortion. She'd gotten pregnant, and she'd gotten an abortion, and was having terrible somatic, repercussions that were just, her body was like tearing itself apart. And so my father, again, liberal, pro-life, Jewish, East Coast Democrat. But there's no ideology when you're treating a patient. You're treating a patient for them to be better. You're treating a patient, right? You're trying to reduce pain and increase their health and well-being. So he called the principal of my high school, who was Jesuit, and said, look, here she is. Here's her local church. And, what do you think about that? He said, well, that priest is very kind of fire and brimstone. And if she goes to him for absolution or for confession, it might be really traumatizing. And my father said, will you come to my office and take her confession in my office? Because the Jesuits tend to be in the more liberal or open-minded part of the church. And so this priest, who we knew was family friends from my going to the high school, came to my dad's office, took her confession, absolved her, and her symptoms cleared up. And if ever there's a story about the importance of meeting people where they are and talking to them in a language and through a value set that they understand for their own prosperity. I mean, he could have gone down the line with drugs and this and that, and she'd probably still be on drugs today and dealing with, physical pain that codes for emotional pain, that codes for psychological pain, that codes for spiritual pain. Right. And so I think that was something that, despite the personal politics in my family, there always was a higher order calling, which was to make people's lives better and to be of service and to try to intervene where there's pain and suffering and injustice, to try to alleviate that with whatever talents that we have and whatever gifts that we have. And so I think that was a baseline for me, that I just grew up as that being something that was the highest sort of familial value.
I mean, good on your dad, right? For thinking about her and coming at this from her life's approach, and for your dad sharing that story with you and with others, right? I mean, it's possible he could have had that happen and just had the arrangement be between he and the priest and the patient, and never narrated the story of a better way to do his
Yeah.
his doctoring.
And of course, it was years later with all proper nouns removed. I just don't, let's not have my dad arrested for HIPAA violations. But yes, he was,
Yes.
he
Yeah.
was,
Well,
but
yeah, there's
it
all,
was part of him saying, you as did my mom. My mom placed kids out of orphanages who had like no limbs. I mean, like it was in families in the U.S. who felt like they were
mm,
put on earth. Some of them of Christian faith to have these kids feel like no matter what they were going to be loved, that they were going to see an inner soul that would not, they couldn't stand the notion of these kids not feeling that they were loved and valued. And it's seeing through. And so whatever ideology, whatever liberal orientation we had, both of them had a higher calling in their professions that wiped that out. As I say, my constant refrain again is, reality is where ideology goes to die. And when you hit it, and when you're confronted with an actual human,
yeah.
you have a choice. And if we want to retreat to ideology over that, then shame on you. You're part of the problem then, probably. But if you're willing to allow your worldview and notions to be cracked open in the service of another human or other people who come from different perspectives, and if you're willing to, when you open yourself up, it's not just to help somebody else, it's to let that mindset and to let that value system into yourself also, right? So it's all additive.
So 5 years ago, you end up in this world doing things differently than you had before. Do you feel like that sense of what you're up to, what your mission is changing now compared to where it was,
Yeah.
in, I don't know, January of 2017?
Yeah. I mean, look, I've been frank and clear that I am not a fan of President Trump and his most staunch allies. That's to me, that's of all the problems. And I think there's a lot of problems on the left and the right. And to me, that's the problem. Like, objects in the rear view are closer than they appear. That's mine. And that leaves open the fact that, some of my friends who I've mentioned see it differently, right? And they pulled the lever twice for Trump. And part of how I look at that is, if these are my friends who are good people who I know, who I trust absolutely, they're a canary in the coal mine for a certain kind of problem. And I don't get to decide that they're an ignorant canary from an ignorant coal mine, right? But likewise, for me, we all come from our personal perspective. There's a bunch of reasons why, for me, the approach that President Trump has taken and that of his allies, that rings alarm bells for me in a different way. And so I think that, early on, it was a big mission of ours to flip the House in 2018. We did a lot of work in that regard. We did a ton of work, increasingly with you and your group too, in terms of providing a bulwark, against that, also into the presidential in 2020. And increasingly, as we're looking forward, part of what I'm realizing is I want to talk to people who, like me, I don't want to do this in 2024 and 2026 and 2028 and 2030 and have this escalating tit for tat of Harry Reid blows up the filibuster and then McConnell applies it to the Supreme Court and then Biden tries to for election. And so what I think this moment is increasingly calling for is a different kind of change rather than opposition, and it's transformational change. And so a lot of where I'm increasingly finding my energy and even calling, if I can call it that, is in translation of literally like trying to translate for different sides, for individuals and leadership on both sides, what the other side is actually saying, to at least have the disagreements at the level that they are, rather than what fear distorts the notion of what the opposing side is, right? Because people tend to be in an escalatory game, people are reacting to their fear about what the opposing side believes, and that causes escalation. So it's translation, mediation, and I hope truth and reconciliation. And so it's moved into a different focus, which I also believe is inclined towards what our Uber strategy has to be. Our Uber strategy has to be anti-polarization. Like, the enemy isn't even the far left and the far right. The enemy is polarization and disinformation, right? The enemy is anti-truth. The enemy are lies, people's reaction to lies, the fear that elicits, and the escalation that causes. And if I can hold that in mind increasingly as the North Star, I still think, and I probably always will, that liberals and classic liberal values um, are the way to go. That's my personality
Yeah.
structure, it's my background, it's where my heart is. And I will try to advocate that in good faith ways to reach an arm across to people and to try and make those arguments as good as possible. But I also have a respect for actual conservative values, and I'm detaching conservatives from Republicans right now, just like liberalism should be detached from Democrats. The parties are these imperfect proxies, and now some might argue even more imperfect than ever of what those beliefs are. But I think the only way for a society to function
Mhm.
is through an interplay between conservatives and liberals. And part of that is these varied trait structures, which we won't delve into too much, but big five personality traits. Many people are familiar with Myers-Briggs. That's like the cliff notes to this.
Yeah, right.
People are pre-selected to have different trait structures. Liberals are higher in openness and empathy. Conservatives are higher in trait conscientiousness. It's not that they lack empathy; it's that there's other values that are primary. And these are spread across every ethnicity and race. It's not like liberalism accrues more heavily to Latinos or to African Americans or to Jews. It's These are common distributions. And there's a reason why we're selected that way, I think, even from an evolutionary perspective, to
Mm-hmm.
confront change, to confront what's happening in the world, to confront what's happening with resources, what's happening with ocean biodiversity, like these giant changes that are happening. We need people who think differently, covering each other's blind spots, right? Working to erode each other's confirmation biases to work together. There's literally is an evolutionary reason for why people think through different value structures, and it's the concert of that. Like, to give a very quick, concrete example, conservatives are lower trait openness, right? Openness is more creatives. It's why Hollywood, right? It's
Right.
why liberals tend to cluster around cities. We like different foods and different ethnicities and different people around. And like that openness, we sort of thrive from change. We're on the forefront of that. And conservatives tend to like boundaries around things, right? They like boundaries around countries. They're more comfortable with boundaries around gender. Um, and we can build a wall. Like, of course, every country needs border security, right? Obviously, there's more intelligent ways to do it than building a wall, I believe. But we need borders security. There's evolutionary reasons for why we need to sort of protect, an internal group from an external group. You think about Native Americans perhaps wanting to have more
Yeah.
hesitation from settlers, right? There's a healthy instinct. And so their job is to make sure that there's protection around groups. And the job of liberals is to say, look, if you make a border, let's say around a country, non-porous, if you make it too sort of unyielding and rigid, new ideas and people won't get in, and we'll stagnate and we'll die financially, emotionally, right? Like the lifeblood will die. And those two notions conveyed not with race and vitriol and judgment, but from a very common set of shared values about the
Mm-hmm.
protection and values and lifeblood of our community. Those things in concert help us mediate the appropriate sort of pace to integrate these changes. And of course, I think if in politics, there's also a practical application. People come in and say, look, of course we want border security. It's a necessity. We want to do it legally and we want to do it humanely. And there's kind of common ground if we can get to, rather than when
Mm-hmm.
the dialogue pushes us about that one side has to become, we're going to build the motto becomes open borders, and the other side comes to having like a towering, you
Yeah.
know,
Build the wall. Right.
Great Wall. It's, then all of a sudden we have failed to adequately convey the underlying values
Hmm.
that we're trying to convey, which come from actually a place of care and concern for families and safety and progress and, integration into a melting pot. We're fed by, immigrants. Our workflow and our culture is. And by the way, so are conservative values. If anything is an antidote to, what people view as sort of out of control levels of privilege, let's say, you get some hardworking immigrants in with a conventional value structure that focuses on family and community. And so everything's more complicated than we boil
Hmm.
it down when we decide it's a team sport.
Right. Well, I've spent my adult life inside of the religious sector and didn't grow up inside of religion. And when I was a late teenager, I
Hmm.
got into Christianity, and it was all new to me. I didn't know how any of it operated. And I was really surprised to meet so many religious Christians who were, by their terms, fundamentalists. And what that meant was that they were separationists, meaning they wouldn't have anything to do with other kinds of people. They wouldn't go to certain movies. They wouldn't be caught in a certain place. You couldn't date somebody outside of your group. And when I determined the distinction between a fundamentalist and non-fundamentalist wasn't their beliefs, it was how determined they were to not live in closeness and proximity to people who were different than they were. And the thing that has scared me in the last 7 or 8 years is how rewarded people are for feeling like it's a good thing to not know people who disagree with you.
Right.
And maybe because I've been in religion, been a little bit of an outlier. I've never felt like, hey, you got to believe everything that everybody else believes. And I only want to disagree with an idea that I know someone who I care about holds that idea. So that in my mind's eye and in my heart, I can truly say, I know someone who believes what I'm about to critique. Because critiquing an idea, easiest thing in the world. To know that this matters to someone, not because of the nature of the belief itself, but because of how it functions in their life. I feel like that's some of what you're getting at too. Like we have to know that these beliefs and these identities and these political or civic or social categories, they're serving people in a certain way. They do something for them to help them thrive as a human being, what they think is thriving. And people don't really know. I mean, you're more of an expert in psychological analysis than I. I love your thoughts on this. When we try to believe that people know why they believe what they believe, and we think, well, if I just ask them more questions and have them tell me, then I'll understand them. You don't really get to understanding by a direct question of why do you support, this candidate, or why do you think building a wall is a good idea? A lot of people are like, I don't know if it's a good idea. I'll just tell you all the people that I like, they think it's a good idea. That's why I think it's a good idea. Do you have any thoughts on this? Like what the
I mean,
separation from one another does, and how do we actually come to understand someone else?
well, look, I don't see the value in having friends who think like me. It's like it's differences are what are challenging and compelling and interesting. If I had a completely, and of course I have friends that we agree with on a lot of issues, but some of my closest friends, we don't agree on a lot of things. I mean, what do we agree on, right? Loyalty, honesty. I mean, like, I'm not talking about those values, but I'm talking about, I don't want to sit around with a bunch of people who hold all of my political and cultural views, my taste in music and food. It's just, to me, there's no there, right? There's nothing that's interesting. And if we think about it, we all know this. Think about it strategically, just for a minute. If we get out of politics, you're starting a company. Do you want to hire everybody who thinks about problems the exact same way you do in every department? Of course not. It's not strategic. In my family, think about in your family. My wife covers my 6 o'clock on so many issues for blind spots, different ways that I approach problems, right? Everything. I don't want to have, I don't want a spouse and life partner who views the world through exactly the same prism as I do. I mean, it's so limiting, and it's limiting in our culture. And I think that the difference is that we don't talk about as much is that lower trait openness. There's plenty of people who like to live and are more comfortable living in a more insulated community. And that's okay. If people want to live if they're in a rural white community in Alabama and that's their comfort level to be around a culture that they're familiar with, if they're in a more insular, let's call it a Cuban American community in Miami, some people choose that, other people don't. I think the issue that we get into is when that perspective gets judged in its own right, or when that perspective solidifies into a hatred or judgment of outside groups, right? And so these differences, we need to have more room to allow the fact that some people don't want like a potpourri of cultural explosion around them all the time, like I happen to love. I mean, that's what I thrive off, and that's perfectly fine as long as it isn't sort of codified into some like negative or horrible view of call it the out group, or what they consider the out group. And the more that we judge, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about the ways that our worst fears as expressed and pushed. We push reality into being around us,
Mm.
um, psychologically, right? Like if let's say I'm in a marriage and I'm someone who's got abandoned by my parents and live in constant fear of abandonment, and I haven't worked on that, and I'm in a marriage that I'm constantly insecure and controlling and judging, and it's like, what's going to happen, right? Probably I'm going to drive the person away, a spouse away, a friend away, whatever it is, until I figure that out. And we're stuck in this cycle, I think, where the left for a lot of years, I mean, remember we were screaming that John McCain was racist. Now, John McCain is a lot of things, some of which I think were unbelievably admirable at a level that's preternatural, and some things which I completely disagree with him on top to
Yeah.
bottom.
Right.
He wasn't racist. He just wasn't. And so, and the right has been saying that the left is, socialist, crazy socialists who want to,
Yeah. Right.
and the more that we pound that, the more that you tell somebody what they are again and again and again, and election after election after election, and cycle after cycle, and the more that is weaponized through or monetized through a news media, through social media, through a gerrymandering structure that means that politicians speak to a more limited group, and the fundraising letters have to be more terrorized. We literally can push into being, the thing that we most fear. And look, that's not to remove the responsibility and culpability of those people in a party who make, immoral, anti-constitutional, and anti-American grabs of power from either side, and those who enable them. I'm not saying that is a dismissal, but I'm saying that when our cultural conversation becomes a reaction of fear and finger pointing, if you tell someone what they are enough, it's a way that we kind of can lean on the fabric. And people tend to understand this so clearly when we talk about a personal relationship. But then in politics, it's less clear. People understand that. If you say to a kid again and again and again, you're a loser, you never see anything through, can't you finish anything? Why can't you see something? It's like, where's a kid going to wind up probably, right? Same's true for adults. We're all just kids who kind of got older, and it's not like the laws of human emotion and psychology no longer hold. And we're pretty far lost now. And one of the things that I think that we call for is there's a different kind of courage. People are mistaking their kind of indoor voice for their speak truth to power everywhere on the line at Starbucks and online voice. And what is courageous isn't necessarily heralding and proclaiming the loudest view about something that garnishes you the most likes. In some ways, the courage of the moment, I think, in some ways, is trying to hold your heart open, right, and to try and hold your mind open to allowing in viewpoints that so many forces in society are pushing us to not. And it can be exhausting. And look, there's times. I mean, I spent the years leading up to the 2020 election talking to every group around the wheel. I mean, evangelicals, military, LGBT community, African Americans, Cuban Americans, different from Texas Mexican Americans, different from California Mexican American. I mean, around and around and around, intellectual dark web. And part of that is you have to allow your brain to stretch out of shape, right? And you have to keep letting in information, and it's hard and it's exhausting. But in some ways, I feel like this is what the calling has to be now. There's not going to be a way forward now that, AOC's elected president and everything's fixed. Donald Trump is elected president again and everything is fixed. We have to figure out a way that we have some transformational impact on the way that we are engaging with each other as citizens, and an awareness that at bottom, aside from a few full-blown bad faith actors, that people love America, right? That they love our democracy, that they love their families, that they love their communities, and that they're coming at this, and being, we're all kind of in the eye of a tornado of disinformation and news of our own making in some ways. And the further you step out to elected office, the more you're stepping out onto the train tracks of that, right? From the media, from people screaming at you in town halls. And it takes I have a lot of admiration for politicians. It's easy to be cynical and dismiss them all as being, self-serving and corrupt. It takes a lot today. You got to be willing to have death threats against you and your kids. You got to be willing to be excoriated in the press. You have to be willing to have half the country hate you at any time, and then the other half hate you if you move in opposition to your party. It's hard. It's hard work, and I'm not arguing that they're all doing the most fantastic job that they should, or that there's not room to grow. But we should all hold a lot of humility in our hearts, right, for people who are navigating out there under the
Hmm. Hmm.
the bright glare of our current culture.
Yeah, and this sort of reminds me of a story that I think I may have told here before. Last fall, we were in Pennsylvania doing an event, and there were protesters there who were pro-life protesters. So they were particularly yelling at the candidate Connor Lamb, who was at our event, about his not supporting their views as a Catholic Democrat. And at the end of the event, this particular woman was talking with a number of us, and she was very aggressive, right? And I was saying to her, try to use my sort of logic sequence. I'm like, hey, look, I can see there's things we agree on and things we don't agree on. You're pro-life, so like me, you probably want to make sure that we treat people humanely on the border. You probably want to make sure we're not executing people through capital punishment. And you probably want to make sure that our social systems are caring for everybody because you care about life. And she said, I don't know why you keep bringing that stuff up. And then she looked square in my face and she said, in fact, if you or any of your Black Lives loving friends came into my house, I'd shoot you dead with a gun myself. Right. And I was like, okay, well, that's interesting. And she's very, like, she wasn't hiding any of that. She's just like, I have very clear boundaries. It's all about abortion and not. And then a few minutes later in the conversation, she looks over at one of our signs that I have hanging on the wall over there that say, faith, not fear, hope, not hate, love for all. And she said, it says, I will vote faith, hope, and love, faith, not fear, hope, not hate, love for all. And she said, but I do agree with you on that sign. Can I take one of those signs home and put it up in my yard? And I said, well, those actually require a $20 donation. She goes, okay, walks to her car, gets $20, comes back, gives us a $20 donation and wants to take that sign home with her. So here she's someone who's just as vehement as she can be. She's threatened, says, do not come into my house, you or any of your people. But I do agree with you that faith, hope, and love was what needs to drive us and needs to come over our lies and our hate. And that's this place of commonality. And that's that mental shape shifting that one has to do, is to say, like, believe her, right? She really does believe that, but constructs that in a totally different way. And, I liked your comment earlier that, like, we're stuck in all this together. Like, she has every right to live in Pennsylvania and vote for candidates and say her thing and carry her signs and raise her voice, and so do I. And how do we make any sense of all of this? And that's really the struggle, right? Is to recognize that even though someone can present so differently how they want the world to go, there's these other things that we hold in common. And sometimes it's that shared thing in common that makes the differences feel so excruciating.
Well, what's the long-term game? I mean, so that's someone who said something that's pretty clearly overtly racist, right? That's not like a dog whistle.
Yeah.
That's a whistle. And so what are the choices, right? Tell her that she's racist, right? Film her, put it online, get her fired from her job, right? Or do you try and plant a seed, right? She's going to take
Yeah, we
that
sent her
sign
home with a
home,
sign
right?
that says "Vote Common Good" on the bottom. Yeah,
Well, the
right.
other
Like,
thing is you can't, people don't know why they think what they think, me included, right? You can't change an ideology, but you can change an action. And sometimes those smallest steps. So guess what? Now she gave you $20. That's a break in habit. It creates cognitive dissonance. Why did I give a guy committed to values different than mine $20 and take home a piece of his messaging and put in my front yard? That sign's going to look at her as much as she looks at it, right?
yeah, yeah.
And so, for our longer term game, right, do we want
Mm-hmm.
to plant seeds even in terrain that is hostile or offensive to us, right? Or do we want to, block that off and block this off and block this off because we know where that goes? And I think there's some clarity about, it's a wonderful thing, and I would argue more courageous in some ways to try and hold yourself open and to try to see in
Yeah.
somebody opportunity rather than just threat.
I remember somebody else who was there said, she probably has a Trump sign in her yard and she's going to put this sign right next to it. And that's going to confuse people on the messaging. And I remember thinking like, that's great. I think we could all use a little more confusion in our messaging. Like that's not a problem. If there are two competing ideas sitting next to somebody's, in somebody's yard, that's not the end of the, I don't think that's the end of the world. Gregg, I want to ask you two other things. I'm always fascinated by people's backgrounds, what they choose to have in the background, and you have a fantastic one. Anything in your background you want to tell us about why it's there, or how it's there, or what's back there?
Well, an orphan act. So now I'm going to pivot to like violence, mayhem, and my assassin thriller novels. Thanks for the lovely transition from my earlier messaging. No, but I write thrillers, which actually a lot of what I'm working on and through come out in. It's another thing that's happened as my clarity in who I am and what role I want to play in society come into alignment. So does my writing and my relationship with my characters. And my character's name is Orphan X. And he's a pro bono assassin. He was trained as a child to be an assassin for the government, and he left, and he now has, he went on the run, he went off the radar, and he has his phone number is 1-855-2-nowhere, which you can actually call. And it's people who are in like desperate situations, circumstances, need. There's no one else to turn to. No one can help them. And they call him, and he picks up the phone, and he will help people who are powerless. It's usually in the jaws of some greater, cultural or societal power, let's say. And he sleeps on a levitating bed. It floats, and there's beds like this that are amazing. They're propelled by magnets, and then they're sort of tethered to the earth with cables. And so as a gift, my publicist got me this plant. He also keeps in his office like the one living thing he keeps in his very modern, clean, stark apartment is an aloe vera plant. And so that plant and he names her Vera, and he has conversations with her, because a lot of what the books are about is his process of becoming more human, of moving from the black and white cut and dried mentality of perfection as an assassin into a greater notion of humanity and intimacy with all of its messiness, right? Which obviously has parallels for what we've been talking about. And so it's a perfect combination of the two, because I have Vera, who is his only living companion in his assassin penthouse, and she's levitating and rotating like his bed levitates. That's part of his his life.
I'll tell you, as someone who's read all these books and can't wait for the next one to come out in a few weeks, the way you use, Evan Smoke, the character Orphan X, as like this stand-in for where we find ourselves as humanity, trying to figure out how to be human. Can we have connection? Can we live beyond our past? Are we simply stuck in what our life has been previously? And is that just a wash, rinse, repeat for the future? Or can we make decisions? This last book, I think I sent you a text while I was reading it. It deals with trauma. My wife is reading a book about trauma and sort of the big issues around trauma, and I'm reading your book, and our conversations are the same, because the issues that so many people feel traumatized. I actually think we live in a traumatized society and country because of so much of our history and the way that we've lived with one another. And so they're really smart books, but also, like you say, they're thrillers. They're the kind of things you read on vacation, and they have some cool, all that sort of cool factor stuff in them, and they're really great. All right, anything else in your background worth mentioning?
Well, it's funny. I've had, like, in some ways, I was talking about these issues of talking about multiculturalism, let's just say, through a lens of joy, right? Because I always feel like that's where we win hearts and minds. Like, I think nothing helped some of the legal discussion around, let's call it, gay rights than having Will and Grace in people's family room, right, once a week, right? Because for people who aren't fortunate enough to have, gay friends in their family and community, it's like, and it's not, hammering about politics the whole time, right? It's just having, like, charming, it's just a great insight. And so it's why I think that carrying things through joy is so helpful. Wow. Another really seminal influence for me were my college roommates. There was 14 of us. we blocked together as undergrads. And it was very rangy. I mean, it was Asian American, Cuban American, Italian, just like a big mix, and more importantly, a big mix of political views, right? Like a lot of conservative Catholics, let's say, right? Like libertarian, everyone really smart, right? And engaged.
Yeah.
And then we had a very big difference in terms of socioeconomic status. And it was really interesting because my friends who were, immigrants, like had to make, wanted to make money. They wanted jobs that were practical. They could see the world in ways I was way more naive than that, right? And I had this set of more kind of intellectual values that were my tethering points for interest. And the exchanges we had, I mean, we disagreed on almost everything, and it was a rambunctious crew. And it never, ever, ever was something that went beyond that to ad hominem attacks, where we started to view one another as being kind of bad or unethical people on the topic of politics, right? Not like everybody was a saint, and not like there weren't personal issues, but when we talked about intellectual, cultural, or political issues, we never had any of that. And it's been funny how that sort of triumph, we talk about these things, but we don't always talk about the positives, right, of what comes out of it. In some ways, it was a triumph of a proper liberal arts education. And I learned more by living in close proximity with a lot of my college roommates. I think I was the most liberal one out of the 14, at least at the beginning of college. And coming from the San Francisco Bay Area, and we just learned, there was so much to learn. Like we had animated fights and arguments and everything. And it's funny because, even today as a touchstone for me, if I'm coming back and my head's spinning or my brain is knocked out of a normal shape, I could reach out to them in different jobs. They're professors and doctors and work on Wall Street. I mean, all kinds of jobs. And just, it's like having an anchor into the ground from these people that we spent 4 years, thrown in together, incredibly diverse, and they see things so differently than I do. And it's been so useful to have this anchoring in those kinds of relationships that you can just trust them. And there's no judgment. They can frankly state how they see things. And they're from slants I don't understand. I mean, and it's amazing the number of kind of biases and blind spots that you can knock off. And I think so in some ways, when I first got to college, they said, look, you're going to learn more from your peers than you will your professors. And we thought, yeah, right. Like, look at the professors at this place, I don't want to learn from these bozos who I'm, but as time goes on, you realize that those bonds, you're talking about how we affect change, right? And I'm increasingly convinced that it's on an individual level. It's on a one-to-one level. And you build and you stitch together and you find people who you trust and you listen. And, there's stuff we're never going to agree on, but there's like a rule that we can, especially with certain ones who I engage with quite a lot, that we'll talk about anything and we'll agree or disagree about anything. And, everyone's going to go home knowing that we have this sort of common bond and we can just sort of knock up against each other. And some of that is knocking off rough edges. And it's been incredibly helpful to stay mired in a world that is, my family is quite diverse. My sister has 3 adopted kids from China. And, we have all this adoption and color and differences in my family, in my community, in my friendships, but also from college. And that is a triumph of the liberal education system as it was then. We had an ability to be able to steel man opposing arguments, to tolerate views that were different. And the triumph of that is the fact that everybody was pulled towards a greater respect and ability to engage through, fair discourse, enlightenment values. In a lot of ways, with all the shouting we have around education and colleges, that thing that to me is just a pure good is often forgotten of what a triumph of that was, at least for me and my group of friends on an individual level.
Well, Gregg, thank you for all your generous work and for your open spirit, kindness, goodness to me, our organization, and just sort of for all of it, and for the books. Thanks. Just really like you a lot, and I think people are really going to be happy to hear this conversation. And obviously, they can go to gregghurwitz.com and get all of this. There's a nice article up on the Hollywood Reporter from last year. If you're interested in the work that Gregg did, you can search the how 5 top screenwriters created $1 billion game-changing political content for free. It's a great story about some of that work that's been going on. That's a good way to also follow along with all of this. So
I will say too that who you have up there on screen, it's so funny when we were working on it. It's, again, how everything comes back to character.
yeah,
Those 4 up there on the screen are, one of the things that we had to do was go into a situation when you go into a political landscape that's that tricky and that sticky. We had to be able to have full openness of views and full trust and full ability that we would all kind of have each other's backs. And part of how we built that enterprise, so much comes down to character. And it's funny because, Billy Ray, Marshall Herskovitz, Lita Kalogridis, and Sean Ryan up there are not just 4 of the finest people who I know, and I had the benefit of working with them closely. One of the things that made this enterprise that we engaged in so easy is they're also 4 creative geniuses. And so it was like this, it was like me being able to interact with this dream team of like, we're trying to figure out messaging. We had total trust and openness about how we had to approach things. It was pragmatic that it was geared towards outcome. And if you have trust, and then it was also like you throw an idea to one of them and they're all creatively brilliant, and it was amazing. And you've overlapped with them as well.
Yeah.
And so that was another part of, I think, really what sustained me through the process were those 4 people. So
yeah, I mean, I will just echo that. In 2020, during the pandemic, we were stuck at home trying to figure out if we're going to get back on the road, trying to do messaging. That's when we met all of you, and I would get off these Zoom meetings with all of you, and my wife would see me smiling and she'd be like, what do you look so happy about, in the middle of all this? I'd say, these Hollywood screenwriter people are just the best. They're the most creative and kind and fun and brilliant. It's really, truly, truly something. So, it feels like it was sort of a moment in time, which was just so enlightening and enheartening.
Yeah, and it's all about building a coalition. Talk about unlikely coalitions, right?
Totally.
I mean, like if you looked at us on paper, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But we, the coalition we put together with people like you, it was amazing. It was amazing, and it was totally necessary. And there's a ton that we, learned from you and augmented and stitched together, and we grabbed you and introduced you to a ton of people we were working with, and vice versa. And in some ways, that's the name of the game. Is you want to get people where you trust that the intentions are good and that you're aligned, kind of on the side that you're working towards, but it has to be people who are also aware that there's a bigger game than sides. And
that's right.
That is increasingly something that's moving to the forefront, I think, for all of us. And so
yeah. It's one of the few things about the last 4 years of the political turn that I'm thankful for. So without all that, and that's just, that's the reality of life, is that even in those difficult times, these otherwise impossible moments wouldn't have come about. So thank you, Gregg. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, all, thanks for being a part of the podcast. We'll be back tomorrow. Our astrophysicist, Paul Wallace, back with us. Lots of things to talk about in space and all the rest of that too. So we'll see you tomorrow.